long before thermostats, microwave dinners, and flannel pajamas. Winter was not a vibe, it was a siege. The cold came on slowly, like an overly dramatic actor entering a stage, whispering through the trees before howling down into the valley with an agenda. And for early communities, those scattered settlements from the crannies of Neolithic Europe to the frostbitten huts of prehistoric Mongolia, enduring winter meant one thing: survive first, sing songs about it later. Our ancestors didn't have central heating, but they did have central fire. The hearth wasn't just a cozy set piece, it was the soul of the household. Everything revolved around it: cooking, storytelling, cat hair. And firewood was the currency of survival. A pile of dry logs was more valuable than a noble's promise. Gathering it was a year-round hobby no one enjoyed, and it usually fell to whoever lost the argument about whose turn it was. Imagine waking up in a one-room roundhouse with a roof of thatched reeds, the wind playing its tin whistle on the cracks in the wall, and the smell of yesterday's turnip soup still lingering in the air, eternally. Outside, the world was painted in shades of brown, grey, and the occasional very lost green. Inside, socks weren't a thing, and neither was privacy. You'd warm your backside near the fire, then turn to evenly roast the front. And that, my dreaming friend, was the morning skincare routine. People clung to community in the same way we now cling to phone chargers. Desperately, and with mild panic when unavailable. Villages were often clusters of mud brick homes or timber cottages huddled close together. Not because medieval architects had a flair for coziness, but because shared walls meant shared warmth. You didn't need insulation when your neighbor's snoring could be heard through the plaster. Food was planned not by calendar, but by spirit. If your dried peas lasted until February, you celebrated. If the salted pork from an autumn slaughter was still edible in March, you were a local legend. This seasonal pantry was kept hidden away like fine wine. Only, it was usually soup ingredients in a wooden barrel, and no one was tipsy, just underfed. Cabbage was a winter delicacy. And no, that's not a joke. Root vegetables in general were the rock stars of the cold months. Potatoes hadn't made their European debut yet, so folks relied on turnips, parsnips, and the eternal question: is this beet still good, or is it growing a second beet? The real showstopper, though, was porridge. Every civilization worth its salt, and even those without any, had a version of porridge. Oats slowly boiled in water until it resembled both food and abstract concept. It was infinite in its uses: breakfast, dinner, building material, and occasionally a laxative. It was eaten daily, unflavoured, unwavering, and unstoppable. Entertainment during winter was the auditory magic of storytelling. As snow whispered against thatch, tales were told with exaggerated flair and a suspicious number of dragons. These stories travelled farther than the people did. Oral tradition was the Netflix of its day, albeit with buffering in the form of elders pausing awkwardly to remember what came next. For children, it meant an education in heroism and hog theft. For adults, a brief escape before remembering that the goat still needed milking. And speaking of goats, they were roommates more than livestock. Animals were brought inside during the harshest months. Your home wasn't just your home. It was also a low-budget petting zoo with no exits. The line between bed and barn blurred in the winter. A calf in the corner, chickens underfoot, and one particularly judgmental sheep acting as the family's unethical moral compass. But perhaps the most important tool early communities had was shared hope, the kind passed around like warm bread, or whatever bread-adjacent thing they had. You endured not just for yourself, but for the other souls huddled behind the same brittle walls. The knowledge that one more night survived meant one more morning of sun creeping over frost-glittered fields. And so they endured, with numb fingers but nimble minds, with too little to eat and too much to repair. Winter reminded them, softly, cruelly, stubbornly, that survival wasn't about what you had. It was about who you kept warm beside you. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let your breath slow as the fire dims and listen closely. Tomorrow, we'll journey further into the stillness. As the snow began to whisper across the worn thatch roofs of early settlements, the people within huddled closer, not just for warmth, but for the marvelous illusion of hope that often settled in beside-body heat. Winter, that steady tyrant, arrived not with the screaming winds we romanticize today, but in creeping drafts, frozen stores of root vegetables and livestock that began to eye their owners suspiciously. There was a quiet agreement between goat and man. Stay warm and don't become each other's dinner. These winter worries weren't reserved for grand empires or fortresses. No, the real theatre of cold survival played out in those early communities. Huddled bands of humans dotting the land like stubborn freckles on a frostbitten face. These were not people who prepared for a 6-month chill with seasonal lattes and novelty socks. These were people who, most winters, weren't entirely sure if they were going to make it. Their tools, limited, their optimism, heroically misplaced, yet oddly effective. Picture this, it's 3200 BCE, and you're in a Neolithic village somewhere in what we now call Europe. Maybe Orkney, maybe not. No one's really keeping track. The sun rises late and forgets to warm much of anything. The wind cuts right through your wool, which was hand-spun by someone who may or may not like you very much. You're standing by a fire that requires constant feeding, blinking smoke out of your eyes, wondering how, in the name of all things, muddy people managed before learning how to dry things properly. The huts are circular, with walls of stone and tight-packed mud, because apparently curves keep the spirits happy and the blizzards confused. Roofs are thatched with straw, reeds, or whatever impersonated thatch well enough to survive a downpour. These weren't cozy cottages so much as organized drafts, glued together by determination and a small but vital amount of domestic bickering. Inside, the community relied on shared warmth and communal effort. The hearth was not merely a spot for cooking barley and occasionally forgetting you'd left the squirrel stew on. It was the center of life, quite literally. Families slept close to the fire, toes nearly in the embers, while listening to the crackling wood narrate its slow demise like a melancholic poet. Preservation was the heartbeat of winter survival. And no, there were no fridges, but yes, early humans were surprisingly good at not dying from spoiled meat. Some dried it, some smoked it, some buried it in ice and hoped the local wolves lacked a sense of smell, ambition, or both. Fermented cabbage made its cameo here too. Not so much out of culinary delight, but as a kind of crunchy vitamin infusion that ensured people didn't pass away midwinter from scurvy or boredom. Now, contrary to popular imagination, these early people didn't spend winter just staring into the gloom, wondering why they hadn't invented Netflix yet. No, they entertained themselves with stories. Spooky ones, scandalous ones, and ones featuring improbably chatty animals. All passed down orally in a swirl of memory, myth, and mild exaggeration. After all, when your uncle is telling about the time he single-handedly frightened off a bear using only his breath and poor hygiene, it's hard not to achieve a certain level of respect, however misplaced. Clothing became its own odd form of innovation, masquerading as fashion. Layers of wool, hide, and sometimes bark, yes, bark, fashion, after all, is subjective, were bound tight with sinew and hope. They made everything scratchy, slightly damp, and perfectly tailored to ensure you wouldn't freeze while chasing after your runaway goat, whose survival instincts were far keener than yours. Oddly enough, warmth wasn't just a physiological mission, it became emotional work too. Songs were invented, repetitive and circular, like the fire circles they were sung around. Rhythms kept the hands weaving, the minds occupied, and the children, mostly, too busy to ask why the soup still tasted like boiled ambition. And then there were the tools. Oh, the tools. Chisels made from flint, bows with sinew strings, baskets woven tighter than some marriages. These items weren't conveniences. They were life insurance disguised as chores. Every flake of stone, every patch of hide lovingly stitched with a bone needle, told a tale of quiet urgency. There was no Amazon, no express delivery of thermal fleece. Your next best tool was whichever one hadn't been left out in the snow or stolen by raccoons of questionable ambition. As the firelight settled deeper into the walls and sleep crept in with the same stealth as the winter wind, the village sighed. Not all was certain, but for now the roof still held, the fire still burned, and someone had just discovered the last handful of dried berries. Soon, when morning arrived, however pale and indifferent, it would be time to check the stores, mend the tools, and brave the snow once again. But tonight, they were together. And somewhere, out beyond the reach of firelight, a new idea was forming. One that might just change how early humans faced the cold. The first frost always came quietly, like a polite guest who didn't want to be a bother but still insisted on freezing everything. One morning, the fields would glitter with a layer of thin silver lace, as if some benevolent forest spirit had tried to knit the earth a blanket, but ran out of yarn halfway through. By then, early agricultural communities knew winter was no longer coming. Winter had unpacked its bags and was asking what's for dinner. The transition from harvest hustle to winter hush was not as serene as we like to imagine while sipping herbal tea in our central heated homes. In the Neolithic era, around 10,000 to 4,000 BCE, long before knitted scarves and sad weather apps, humans relied on their wits, their fire pits, and an alarming number of root vegetables to survive the longest months. At the heart of community survival was storage, an impressively mundane word that, for early societies, had the gravitas of divine intervention. Granaries emerged not just as food lockers, but as the cornerstones of winter hope. Built from mud brick, woven reeds, or timber frames sealed with daubs of clay, they housed the harvested grains with almost sacred reverence. Some communities even buried their cereals in ceramic pots underground, essentially inventing the ancient equivalent of a root cellar crossed with a time capsule, though less open in 1,000 years, and more open when hunger starts making you hallucinate bread. Legumes, pulses, and whatever nuts hadn't been stolen by squirrels were tucked away too, each family relying on careful planning and sometimes the hope that their neighbor had been slightly more organized. But food wasn't the only problem. There was also the threat of freezing to death, which, it turns out, was remarkably unpleasant. Most early housing designs were not draftsman certified for thermal efficiency. We're talking about wattle and daub huts, semi-subterranean dwellings, and the occasional truly committed sod house, built with grass and soil to better insulate against that crisp winter air. These homes were often low-ceilinged and smoky, with a central hearth blazing low and steady, less to cook over and more to stop one's toes turning into archaeological artifacts. Animal skins became the fleece pajamas of prehistoric times, and layering wasn't a fashion choice, it was a strategy. Those lucky enough to have domesticated sheep or goats didn't just use them for milk or occasional protein. They harvested the wool, combed it painstakingly by hand, and began to fashion rudimentary felted garments. And yes, this might have been the genesis of the eternally mysterious itchy wool sweater that humanity just can't seem to quit. Staying warm was a communal effort. People huddled together for heat, slept close, and sometimes brought livestock inside. An idea that made sense thermodynamically, but not olfactorily. One can imagine a prehistoric child trying to doze off in a family roundhouse, eyes watering from the scent of wet goat, while someone quietly played a bone flute in the corner. Pure ambience. Beyond the physical challenges, there was also the small matter of staving off existential dread. And so, winter traditions began. They sang songs, chanted verses that were both comforting and practical, often instructing when to plant, how to store, and not to eat the seeds saved for spring. Elders told stories by firelight, myths that danced between stars and soil, giving shape to a cold season that might otherwise feel like endless struggle. These weren't merely diversions. They were instruments of social survival, keeping morale and perhaps sanity intact when snow muffled the world into quiet white. Even early art played a role. Carvings, painted symbols, and ritual figures were created during these damp, dim months. Some archaeologists posit that these weren't just aesthetic ventures. They may have been winter projects, not art for beauty, but art as company. A mammoth etched into bone might have reminded someone that there had been movement and life out there once. A clay figure tucked into a hearth alcove might have been a wish for warmth that lasted past solstice. So winter, in all its long, frozen indifference, became bearable not because humans conquered it, but because they adapted to it, with shared resources, daring innovations, and occasionally using animals as living hot water bottles. There's something steadying in knowing that when the nights grew long and the days short, people turned to each other with stories, fire, and whatever roots they could dig up from the frostbitten ground. And just as the snow drifted up against the edges of their homes, quiet and determined, so too did their small practices drift forward through time, shaping how future humans would chase warmth, both inside and out. Now, let's peer into one of those semi-dark dwellings, where the air smells of peat smoke and someone is about to discover the magic of bone needles and sinew. As the skies darkened earlier and earlier each afternoon, ancient villagers didn't check wall calendars or digital apps. They felt the shift in bone and soul. Winter was not a season, it was a phenomenon. Time slowed, the world muffled itself, and everything seemed designed for either survival or napping. Entire communities became experts in endurance, which was essentially the polite version of panicking on a schedule. With limited tools, they stared down the great freeze like a squirrel watching its last acorn roll into a snowbank. Now, the tools of the early wintering folk were not flashy. There were no thermostats, no down-filled jackets with 16 zippers, and certainly no emergency delivery of high-carb snacks. What they did have was resourcefulness, sometimes thoughtful, sometimes desperate, always slightly smoky. Consider the hut, a low-slung, smoke-filled wonder of engineering, smelling faintly, of old moss and onion breath. Roofs were thatched tightly with straw, sod, and whatever the goats hadn't eaten. Walls might be made from wattle and daub, a charmingly rustic mix of mud, sticks, and hope. If you were lucky, someone had thrown in some dung for a bit of insulation. Yes, dung. An unsung hero of winter comfort, warming many a chilly bottom. Inside the hearth wasn't just a fireplace, but the entire heart and lung system of the dwelling. Without it, you were essentially camping in an ice bucket. People rarely volunteered to stray far from its gentle glow, unless absolutely necessary, such as using the latrine. A frozen dilemma best approached quickly and with mental fortitude. Blankets were not taken lightly. In fact, woven textiles were a kind of celebrity in early communities. To spin, weave, sew, and stitch a single woolen piece took dozens of hours, and possibly an entire lifetime's worth of small arguments over whose turn it was to gather brambles. Blankets were passed down generations, occasionally patched over with fabrics from prior centuries, becoming a cozy documentary of near misses and clever repairs. But warmth wasn't strictly physical. No early humans knew how to huddle, for warmth, for whispers, for shared stew that doubled as small talk. In some communities, it was common to share a bed with multiple family members, pets, and one extremely judgmental chicken. Not for moral reasons, but because the chicken had been there longer than anyone else and refused to leave. You might laugh, but bed sharing was as much a survival tactic as any great invention. A medieval proverb may well have been, "The family that sleeps in a pile avoids frostbite," likely followed by, "But someone always steals the blanket." Food storage during winter was an ongoing moral tale about hope, greed, and turnip fatigue. Root cellars dug deep into the ground became sacred shrines to gnarled tubers, and jars of things floated in vinegar. Without refrigeration, preservation became an art form. Meat was salted, fish was smoked, and cabbage was brined until it had enough personality to argue back. The flavor choices were limited, though not without drama. Some communities supplemented meals with dried herbs kept in brittle cloth sacks, traded with neighboring families who knew what time was, but still couldn't spell it. Spices, of course, existed in only the most fortunate and well-traveled settlements. For everyone else, the excitement of winter cuisine came from the moment you realized the mush you're eating tonight wasn't yesterday's mush, but rather last Thursday's. Boredom, that quiet enemy of the wintry mind, was managed with storytelling, singing, and games such as Let's Not Go Outside. Children learned history through oral tales by elders who had a flair for dramatics, embellishing everything to make the snow feel less cold. And then, they'd say, leaning over the firelight in hushed tones, a rabbit the size of a cow dashed across the forest, leading us to a stash of berries that lasted until Candlemas. Whether or not giant rodents were a real part of the record was irrelevant. What mattered was time passing, and hope trembling gently in the half-light of flickering flames. It wasn't glamorous, it rarely smelled nice, but winter taught early communities to move slowly, breathe deeply, and be stubbornly, clumsily human. And just beyond the edge of those frozen fields, something else stirred quietly in history's long slumber. They had wolves to think of next, maybe not just the four-legged kind, while the frost outside thickened like buttermilk left too long in the churn. The early villagers leaned deeper into the gentle science of survival. They had no guidebooks, nor apps reminding them when to gather pine resin or dry fish bladders for waterproofing. What they had was memory, passed down through smoky fireside mutters and grandmotherly side-eye. And though the world beyond their clustered huts was cold, wild, and a bit too wolfy, the inside world, the human world, was knit tightly by ritual, adaptation, and the occasional well-timed fart to lighten the mood. Fire, of course, was the big star of the winter show, not just for heat, though that was non-negotiable, but also for light, comfort, and occasionally burning your only pair of leggings by accident. Most hearths were fed obsessively, as if the family's entire emotional stability depended on how cheerful and consistent the flames looked, which, in a way, it did. You see, in a winter where daylight lasted about as long as the last oatcake, people needed something to stare into dramatically while pondering life, or at least planning stew rotations. Gathering firewood, however, was a sport of athletic desperation. Your average winter log had to be earned, hacked from frozen branches with axes that barely held their edge, then dragged home by sled or shoulder, often, while your beard acquired dramatic icicles that felt noble initially and horrible once indoors. A good haul could spark mild applause. A poor haul could spark mild exile, or worse, kindling duty. Clothing, too, became less about style and more about stacking every vaguely warm object you owned onto your limbs. Layers of wool, hide, and plant fibers were strapped and tied with a level of complexity that would later inspire invented fashion crimes like the cravat. Men and women alike bundled so thoroughly that they became less like people and more like ambulatory storage units for lint and survival hopes. And yes, somewhere underneath 6 layers of rabbit fur, your uncle still insisted on keeping his breeches tidy. It was a matter of pride. Communal meals were another ritual that did more than just feed bellies. These dinners were diplomacy, morale boosters, story time, and therapy, all disguised as turnip stew. Villagers gathered in the largest hut or meeting space, bringing whatever they had. Maybe a smoked fish, a bundle of dried herbs, or, in more optimistic years, something with actual flavor. The pot was big, the ladles were bigger, and if someone brought a chicken, it was treated like royalty, told tales, sung to, and then promptly boiled. And oh, the storytelling. When the winds howled and the thatch groaned under snow, the human voice took center stage. Elders spun tales of how the ancient mountain once sneezed and created the valley, or how stars were the eyes of helpful spirits too shy to intervene directly. These stories, depending on the teller and the wine situation, ranged from profound to wildly inaccurate, but oddly compelling. One tale described how a man wrestled winter into submission using only a soup spoon and stern language. No one believed it, but they smiled politely, because that man, coincidentally, was still alive and prone to correcting you. And while we're on the subject of animals, livestock were brought indoors, not metaphorically, literally, in the house, tucked near the hearth. Chickens clucked under benches like feathered footstools, goats stared at you judgmentally from corners, and pigs occasionally sighed like unpaid renters. It wasn't glamorous, but the extra body heat helped, and nothing says intimacy like waking up to a cow's nose softly judging your dreams. Tools, of course, were in short supply. A single iron knife might be shared among a family, or even a whole village, like a community elder who also happened to cut onions. Bone needles were treasured, lost with great mourning, and rediscovered stuck into the hides of capes like ancient bookmarks. Repairing a broken shovel often required prayer, bartering, and a neighbour with at least partial blacksmithing ambition. If no such neighbour existed, the shovel became a shelf. Still, somehow, between the flicker of flame, the warmth of goats, and the glorious unifying power of fermented barley, people found comfort. They didn't just survive the winter. They endured it beautifully, ideally with fewer frostbitten limbs than last year, and a couple of new songs to hum while stirring the stew. Outside, the snow continued falling like cold feathers from a sky lined with old secrets. But inside, there was laughter, quiet snoring, and the soft mutters of someone telling the firewood it was doing just fine. And soon, as the moon shifted higher over the snowy roofs, something curious would begin to stir, not in the woods, but in the minds of the villagers. Something about change, something they'd heard in whispers. High in the crook of a frozen valley, snug between two anonymously lumpy hills, our prehistoric neighbours of long ago did something that might surprise you. Not hunting or fire starting, or yelling at the sky for more mammoths, but organising. Not a modern-day to-do list, of course. You won't find bullet journaling etched into cave walls. But winter brought more than just snowflakes and icy noses. It brought the need for plans. See, when the last acorns had been mashed into porridge, and the final fish had been over-smoked into the texture of ancient beef jerky, early humans turned to that most underappreciated survival tactic, community logistics. There was often a kind of instinctive planning committee, usually composed of people who couldn't physically flee fast enough when someone asked, who should oversee the food storage? These early coordinators weren't elected per se, but if they had warm layers and a loud voice, they became the nearest thing to winter administrators the world had ever seen. They had to keep track of critical supplies, dried meat, smoked roots, animal fat, and whatever remaining berries hadn't fermented into prehistoric wine. Because while fermented berries will make you warm and chatty for an evening, they do not, alas, fill your belly until spring. And so, long before Excel spreadsheets and emergency ration kits, the torch was passed to whoever remembered which tree stump was currently functioning as the pantry. Interestingly, early communities devised their own kinds of cold season economies. Instead of currency, they operated on a squintily upheld barter system. A few sinews from a dried elk could be traded for a fur scrap, or maybe a handful of jaw-wrenching frost-hardened tubers. The carefully stashed marrow bones, nature's snack sticks, were treasured like gold, not because they were shiny, but because they were chewable. And while we often picture our ancestors as desperately stoic, braving the elements by sheer grit and grumbling, they were also, surprisingly, resourceful in the coziness department. Snow, after all, is excellent insulation. Not so great for sandals, but wonderful for redirecting warmth. Early shelters, especially in northern climates, incorporated snow walls or were partially sunken into the earth. Some communities even burrowed into old riverbanks or built up natural mounds of soil and stone, resulting in dwellings that resembled hobbit homes. If the hobbits had been extremely cold, slightly hungry, and hadn't invented proper doors, inside fire pits were circled with stones for cooking and warmth, central to life in a way our scented candles only dream of. One flame fed the household, helped tan hides, dried meat, and warmed fingers that had spent hours scraping something usefully unpronounceable from the local forest. And as the days grew shorter and night began arriving promptly at mid-afternoon, time indoors stretched. That meant talk, endless talk. Stone Age gossip, myth-telling, and exaggerated storytelling filled the void. If one person began recounting the great chase of the moose that wasn't actually a moose but a confused cow, you bet someone else would jump in halfway to clarify that actually the cow had been painted with stripes, probably by mischievous adolescents with too much leisure and too few chores. These stories weren't just entertainment, though they were often funny enough to cause near suffocation by dried carrot bite. No, they were survival tools, oral blueprints for how to divine the weather, predict animal behavior, and get along with mother-in-law grandmothers who claimed to know how to control the wind. Even children weren't idle. They learned by imitation how to stitch sinew, scrape hides, count stores, and most importantly, how not to eat the bitter seeds that were only ever collected so Uncle Larrick could see what would happen if someone else tried them. In these quiet, snowbound weeks, communities didn't just survive. They practiced continuity. They shared knowledge, warmth, laughter, and the occasional bitter regret over a misplaced mushroom. And just as the fire burned low and the cave shadows stretched long across the sleeping firs, someone would remember. There was one more job to do. Someone had to go check on the dried fish stash. Naturally, the job often fell to whichever teenager had just rolled their eyes at a story for the third time. As they trudged out wrapped in layers of fur, muttering about the injustices of elder tales, the rest of the family nestled in for another cold hour of heat, stories, and the quiet crackle of flame. And as the snow sighed softly against the stone walls, far above in the black winter sky, the stars kept watch. Soon, their light would help someone else find their way to a colder but essential destination, the pit latrine. But that quiet frontier, we shall wander very gently. Next, by the time midwinter had its frosty boots well planted on the necks of early communities, people weren't just cold. They were inventively, defiantly, colossally creative about being cold. For them, survival wasn't just about gritting one's chattering teeth and hoping the snow wouldn't drift too enthusiastically into the cooking pit. No, enduring winter required the kind of ingenuity usually reserved for foxes, with PhDs and squirrels on their third cup of fermented sap. Allow me to paint a scene for you. You're nestled in some cozy corner of a longhouse, wrapped in a pelt that used to belong to something grisly and not particularly agreeable. Outside, the wind howls like a flute played by a confused bard. But inside, there's warmth. Not electrical, not central, and certainly not programmable with a thermostat, mind you, but warmth nonetheless. A complex cocktail of fire, furs, and 40 relatives snoring gently into each other's armpits. See, humans had a method called aggregate body heat, which, while sounding scientific, was mostly an advanced form of organized cuddling. The average winter sleeping arrangement wasn't terribly romantic, unless you're particularly fond of Aunt Hilda drooling on your shoulder. Yet, snuggled between Uncle John's elbow and the family goat, one did tend to remain at least lukewarm through the night. The fire, mankind's oldest and his oldest, most demanding pet, was never allowed to die out. Whether dug into the center of a Neolithic longhouse or flickering inside a crude hearth of stone, fire was sacred, not just for warmth, but also company. It crackled and shifted like gentle conversation, often more intelligent than half the people listening to it. No one knew then how carbon monoxide worked, but everyone knew to leave a few gaps between the reeds and straw for the smoke to sneak out. Occasionally, it refused, and the ceiling turned into a duet of soot and guilt. By midwinter, provisions were running low, and cooking creatively became a kind of culinary lottery. Would tonight's stew be made from turnips, dried berries, and shoe leather soaked in broth? Or would someone finally crack and add Uncle John's leftover boot from the solstice celebration? Recipes weren't written down so much as vaguely felt, whispered, or muttered irritably over steaming pots of questionable ingredients. Fermentation, the ancient world's answer to flavor, preservation, and mild escapism, was in full swing. Whether it was beer in Mesopotamian clay pots, kvass in Slavic wooden barrels, or surprisingly hostile cabbage-based concoctions buried beneath 2 feet of snow and hope, our ancestors were busy bubbling up whatever the earth had forgotten to freeze. These beverages weren't just for cheer. Some of them were safer to drink than the local water, especially if said water had recently been visited by livestock doing what livestock always do. Clothing during these times began to resemble both armor and origami. Layers upon layers of wool, fur, and woven grasses were piled onto human forms until they more closely resembled ambulatory haystacks than functioning adults. If you think fashion today is painful, imagine trousers made of stiff hide that hadn't quite finished drying and still smelled faintly of mammoth. Waste not, want not, they believed. Even the smallest fabric scrap became a mitten, or a pouch, or, if you were particularly desperate, a napkin you could wear on your head for warmth. Creativity, after all, heightens when hypothermia is nipping at your toes. Children, surprisingly, had endless energy, regardless of seasons or rationing. With sleds carved out of discarded shields or bark, they whooshed down snowy hills and promptly into freezing ponds that they swore they meant to avoid. Laughter echoed through villages, softened and muffled by snow, reminding everyone that joy wasn't just for summer solstice dances and favorable planting signs. As winter deepened, so too did the customs that would become traditions. Stories were bartered like bread. Legends grew long beards and cozy exaggerations. Elders recounted times when winters were colder, but hearts were warmer. A phrase uttered in every century by someone 3 blankets deep and mildly dramatic. And above all, time itself seemed to slow. Days were brief, yes, but nights. The evenings stretched, luxuriously, as if the universe had given everyone just a bit more dark to gather under, to huddle close, and to whisper tales of wild boars, wayward sons, and the promise of Thor. Now, let's follow that promise, softly, quietly, into the twilight of deeper winter, where lamps flicker low and something curious stirs in the cold. By the time the frost truly settled in, and the world outside became a snow globe with all the joy and none of the central heating, early human communities had to embrace their inner squirrels. Not in the literal sense, of course, although wearing fur did help, but in the great and noble art of food storage. You see, while today we might pop down to the supermarket for some emergency pesto and a pint of oat milk, our ancestors had to invent winter survival with essentially 4 items: rocks, smoke, blisters, and blind optimism. The brave souls of early settlements learned that the only thing chillier than mid-February was running out of calories in mid-February. Thus began the great tradition of storing food for winter, not because it was fun, but because not doing it had rather permanent consequences. One of the earliest winter pantry staples was the humble root vegetable. Turnips, beets, and other spherical bundles of underground companionship thrived at doing exactly what the winter demanded, staying alive in the cold. Communities would dig root cellars, deep cool spaces beneath their homes or cottages, somewhere between a basement and a mossy dungeon, where potatoes would wait patiently for their destiny to be mashed. Salt, meanwhile, performed miracles on meat. With no refrigerators and only the occasional accidental glacier, salting allowed communities to preserve fish and game for weeks or months. There's a reason many ancient people looked at salt with the reverence of a precious metal, except salt tasted better on grilled mammoth. Fish was gutted, cleaned, and packed in salt so generously it could easily star in an early medieval cooking show under the segment "Things That Last Forever If You Don't Breathe Near Them." Smokehouses also became key players in the winter kitchen drama. These cozy little structures, part tool shed, part flavor wizardry, were used to dry and smoke meats. And if the smokehouses were built near homes, the scent of wood smoke and venison would drift through villages like an edible blanket. It was both survivalism and the earliest known attempt at marketing to neighbors via smell. But food storage wasn't just for meat and tubers. Nuts were gathered, dried berries were strung together like prehistoric popcorn garlands, and grains were hoarded with a sense of seriousness, rivaling modern online shopping sprees. A single granary could determine whether a village faced feast or famine. Grain had to be safe from mice, damp, and teenage boys searching for snacks. And perhaps no winter preparation brought as much daily joy and inevitable arguments as baking. Bread wasn't just food, it was ritual. In cold months, women would rise, at hours even less charming than 5 a.m., knead dough by the hearth, and bake loaves that were crackling warm and thick with the scent of resilience. These loaves were shared like stories and often flavored with whatever herbs had managed to dry above the fire instead of falling in it. Clothing, too, played a role in food gathering and preservation. Furs were not only worn for warmth, but sometimes used to wrap delicate food items. A culinary fashion statement, if you will. There's some evidence across multiple cultures of wrapping cheese in leaves or even fur to protect it in storage. You've heard of cave-aged cheese? Well, this was its prehistoric cousin, cravaged cheddar perhaps. And where food ended, stories began. With bellies full and snow gently blanketing the world outside, early communities would gather by the fire, kettle steaming, telling sagas of how Uncle Ilfa once caught 3 fish in one go because he tripped into the river with a spear. There was laughter, there was warmth, and most importantly, there was steaming stew in a pot big enough to feed 12 determined eaters and a hungry dog named probably Bark. Yes, among the cracks in the walls and the smoke-stained ceilings, winter was met with creativity, shared labor, and just enough salted fish to develop lifelong grudges. As the wind hummed through the thatched rooftops and the firelight flickered across wooden beams, the villagers would begin to settle in for another long, cold night, one small spoonful of porridge at a time. And yet, beyond the preserved meats and the dried herbs, another force stirred gently under winter's icy curtain. The long tradition of winter festivals, where people danced not because they weren't cold, but because they very much were, and hoped the gods were watching. But more on that, when the stars shimmer just a little more softly. Let us now wander into the most subtle, and perhaps the most deceptively thrilling of winter survival arts. The act of doing, essentially, nothing. As the snow deepened and the temperatures dipped into a personal rivalry with frostbite, early communities entered a state of patient hibernation, not unlike bears, but with more knitting and fewer claws. You see, once the root cellars were packed tighter than an overachieving squirrel's pantry, and the last of the firewood was stacked with mathematical precision and arguments about stacking technique, there came a stretch of time when the to-do list simply ended. There were no crops to tend, no herds to chase, and no urgent need to invent modern dentistry just yet. Instead, people turned inward, both physically into dimly lit dwellings and mentally into the strange pastime of waiting gracefully. Now, doing nothing might strike the modern mind as a delightful spa day with warm socks and a podcast. But for our ancestors, it was a craft, honed over thousands of winters. They took the lack of external stimulation and repackaged it into tradition, storytelling, and occasionally over-involved discussions on the merits of different stew-thickening agents. Some communities used barley flour, others swore by mashed tubers. Debates grew so intense that it's likely more than one particularly spicy winter argument ended in pouty silence across the communal fire pit. But the stories. Oral tradition was the Netflix of pre-modern life, except the subscription was free, though you were expected to participate, and there was no skip intro button. Stories were told long and winding, often starting with a sentence like, "In the time when your grandfather's grandfather could speak to wolves," and ending when half the room was asleep and the other half was snoring with theatrical disbelief. These tales weren't just idle entertainment. They were storage lockers of memory. In them lived warnings about thin ice, flattering accounts of heroics, foraging, and low-key explanations for why you should never trust goats named Milda. Whether true or tall, the stories were embroidered with snow-heavy metaphors and habits of speech so poetic you could warm your hands on them. With daylight pared down to a few golden hours, early people became connoisseurs of candlelight ambience, oil lamps, animal fat candles, and eventually beeswax glowed from corner to corner, casting sublimely flickering shadows that psychologists centuries later would one day describe as quite soothing. Family units, often large and layered like onions in wool, gathered in tight rooms to share heat and space and occasional passive-aggressive comments about someone snoring. Nights stretched long, and with nothing to farm or forge, life became looped in rhythm. Eat, talk, mend socks, sleep, repeat. And oh yes, the mending. If a sock had a hole, it gained immediate emotional depth. Blankets were patched lovingly, sometimes until they weighed more than the livestock outside. Woolen garments were more darning than original, stitched with care and the occasional muttered curse in Old Norse or Proto-Gaulish, depending on the region and one's mood. Every item was a tapestry of winters past. Children would be taught games that required little space and less shouting, unless, of course, someone cheated, and then everyone learned new vocabulary. Some communities had indoor sports so slow-paced they'd make chess feel fast. One such game, called knucklebones, a proto-dice game played with sheep bones, could occupy a particularly grumpy teenager for entire afternoons with minimal risk of sweeping drama. Winter's great silence offered time for reflection, for planning future planting seasons, and for wondering whether this year's sun would return sooner or fashionably late, as it had last year. Astrology, weather omens, and the specific behavior of the local squirrel population were all called into service to make such predictions. If 3 squirrels darted east before noon, it meant an early thaw. If they just stared at you judgmentally, well, probably more snow. In between these gentle rituals of patience, communities found a way to let the season of stillness become its own rhythm. Life pared down and stripped of summer's bustle was lived in simmering pots, whispered tales, and the quiet comfort of surviving together. And just as the cold outside reached its deepest hush, another method of quiet endurance emerged: the humble art of wintertime music, not performed, but hummed, shared, and passed down like a well-loved recipe. That, dear listener, is where we turn next. into the wooden halls and wool-lined dreams of songs meant not to entertain, but to endure. When winter deepened and the frost crept like a polite but persistent visitor into every crevice of the early communal dwellings, people turned their attention to the universal question of survival, and more importantly, how not to freeze one's backside senseless while doing it. In the low-lit huts of Neolithic villages or timbered longhouses of Iron Age settlements, warmth was not a convenience, it was a ritual. They didn't have electric blankets or cocoa with precisely 1.5 marshmallows. No, they had smoky fire pits, thick animal hides, and the kind of stubborn resilience only someone who lived on boiled root vegetables for 6 months could muster. The hearth, always the heart of the home, was more than a place for roasting questionable-looking tubers. It was a generational gathering ground, combining the functions of kitchen, coffee table, group therapy, and sometimes birthing suite. The fire at its center wasn't merely practical, it was symbolic. A flame kept alive all winter symbolized safety, sustenance, and occasionally an excuse to avoid going outside for anything less than a bear crashing through the grain storage. Now, I know what you're wondering. How on earth did they manage to stay warm with those drafty doorways made from poorly behaved mud and thatch? The answer, dear listener, lies in the ancient and noble art of layering. Forget your fleece-lined designer gear. These people did winter fashion their way. Wool, hide, more wool. One itchy sock that somehow outlived 3 generations. And if you were lucky, a reindeer pelt that was repurposed from Uncle Haldor's ceremonial robe after he got too attached to that goat and moved to the hills. Wool was prized not just for its warmth, but because sheep had the decency to grow it every year, unlike bearskin, which required, well, bear interaction. In Scandinavia, women spun and wove with relentless rhythm through winters, crafting textiles dense enough to repel the breath of a Norse wind god, and potentially small projectiles, depending on the village's weaving skills. Sleeping, too, became a group event. Most early dwellings weren't divided into rooms, but were instead single, smoky chambers where entire families slumbered side by side, all cozied up like a bundle of mismatched socks. Dogs, chickens, and occasionally a mildly judgmental goat would join the pile. It was body heat socialism at its finest. Privacy was non-existent, but hypothermia had far worse PR. And those fires, always tended, always coaxed. Those fires. Their fuel, often scavenged wood, dried dung or peat, was stored with near religious devotion. Peat, that miraculous half-fossilized bog fuel, was especially beloved in damp northern Europe. If you were Irish, you could thank 1,000 years' worth of stubborn moss for making your stew warm and your fingers thaw. Clever folk used radiant heat from stones warmed in these blazes. Stone acting rather like the world's first hot water bottle, but significantly less cuddly. They'd pop a warm stone beneath furs, and voila, early civilization's contribution to heated bedding. If it cooled too quickly, you could always grumble dramatically, then toss it back in the fire with the flair of someone who was clearly born before thermodynamics. In regions with a bit more architectural ambition, such as ancient Rome or parts of the Middle East, people even had heated floors. Hypocore systems involving subfloor furnaces and hot air channels. Imagine that, a literal warm floor, as long as the slaves kept shoveling wood into the bottomless pit of busy engineering. Not exactly widespread in your average Bronze Age cattle hut, but it does show that even back then, everyone appreciated toasty toes. What united all these early communities across vast continents was the same guiding principle of winter survival: Lean in. Lean into each other, to your furs, to your fire, to the pot of soup that had yesterday's parsnips and last week's mystery meat, now lovingly renamed hunter's stew. Lean in, because getting through winter wasn't just about keeping the body warm, it was about warming the soul. Stories were told with dramatic gestures, beads were carved by firelight, and songs were hummed that no one quite knew the words to anymore, but sang anyway. They believed, quite sensibly, that laughter mixed well with broth, and that no hardship couldn't be softened by a well-placed joke from a grandfather with questionable teeth and impeccable timing. And as icicles stretched further from thatch roofs and snow melted down through cracked chimneys, they kept the flame alive, nurturing it not just with brushwood, but with hope, with songs, and with the occasional sheep who was too fond of heat to sleep anywhere else. As the wind howled a lullaby outside their walls, they huddled closer still, turning toward the glow with eyes half shut, dreaming warm dreams, waiting for the faintest hints of spring to creep back and remind them it was all worth enduring. Outside, the snow drifts deepened. Inside, a rabbit stew simmered, and somewhere, a young boy poked the embers with a stick, not knowing that tomorrow would require the kind of cleverness for which winter had become quietly famous. Somewhere in the frayed folds of a woolen cloak and behind the quiet breath of a snow-laced fir tree, an early winter village settled into its seasonal rhythm. Cold had become not a visitor, but a roommate, uninvited and nosy, peeking through every gap in every hut, sampling everyone's porridge steam, and commenting quite rudely on the state of your socks. Yet people endured. They always did, in the frozen still of mid-season, when even the sun looked a little apologetic for not trying harder. Early communities leaned into a peculiar winter practice, doing absolutely as little as possible. For 9 months of the year, life meant movement, planting, building, repairing, harvesting, fetching things with ropes and baskets and very tired knees. But in winter, a hush fell over daily life. People moved slower, spoke softer, thought longer, and invented excuses for why the roof definitely did not need fixing just yet. Perhaps tomorrow, or the next thaw in 2 months. Cozy hibernation wasn't just for bears. It was a kind of spiritual, social, and practical necessity for humans too. By this time of year, with the turnips dutifully stored, and the root cellar only slightly haunted by the neighbour's curious goat, people bundled together in shared spaces. Multi-generational longhouses or snug stone huts filled with quiet company and the scent of whatever was still slightly edible. Dried meats, fermented cabbages, smoked fish. It was less Michelin star and more, well, you won't die today. Fire, of course, was the star of the show. Flames pulsed like heartbeats in the centre of homes, sometimes in stone hearths, sometimes in clay-lined pits. Children were employed as sort of designated smoke detectors. If one passed out coughing, it was time to open the flap for a bit. Fire wasn't just for heat, mind you. It was the original television. People stared into it, told stories around it, performed songs beside it, and occasionally argued about whose job it was to keep it from going out at 3 a.m. Arguments settled quickly, because no one fancied being the one responsible when the frost decided to redecorate your eyebrows. Candles were precious. Wax was not made quickly nor cheerfully. This meant people synchronized their schedules suspiciously well with the sun. To be fair, the sun was showing up less and less, like an unreliable bus schedule posted in a dimension where time is irrelevant. So people went to bed early, woke late, and lived by flickers and embers. Now, let us not forget fashion. Winter attire in prehistoric and early settler communities was less about trends and more about full-body survival. Think layers, and then more layers. Then the fur of an animal who probably sighed dramatically before becoming your coat. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, fur-lined boots, thick cloaks. If you could move, you were underdressed. Children, delightfully unaware that adulthood meant worrying about the root cellar freezing shut again, made their own fun. They rode sleds made from bark or smooth bone runners, found amusement in icicles shaped like vaguely rude gestures, and subjected their long-suffering parents to songs with precisely 3 notes and infinite choruses. Anything to lift the gloom. You might wonder how socializing fared during these frost-laced months. Well, winter gatherings were cherished. If a neighbor trundled over with a jug of barely passable mead and news of a cow that gave birth too close to the hearth, it counted as entertainment. In fact, any news at that time of year, whether it involved a stuck door or an unusually optimistic crow, was reason to sit down and listen. And what of mental health, you ask, sipping your imagined cup of evening tea? Believe it or not, people practice their own cozy rituals of well-being. Weaving, spoon carving, mending clothes, no one ever truly finished mending. These weren't just chores, they were companionship in the shape of motion, a sort of murmuring meditation by candlelight. Above all, winter was an unwelcome but effective teacher. It hummed softly in the background. Make do, huddle closer, speak with care, share your warmth. It reminded communities that while tools might be few and the weather grim, hope gave the best kind of insulation, quiet, shared, and renewable. And as the snow whispered across the roof and night deepened like ink in a storyteller's inkwell, something else stirred too, a winter tradition freshly beginning. Somewhere between the creaking of old wooden beams and the whistle of wind through poorly insulated walls, our ancestors carved their way through the long, unrelenting silence of midwinter, with no podcast to distract them, no Wi-Fi to quietly fade in and out while trying to stream a drama set in a cottage more insulated than theirs. People in early communities endured winter as a tactile, earthen experience. It was cold. It was slow. It involved a lot of root vegetables. By the time winter truly sank into the bones of the land, most survival efforts had already been decided by decisions months earlier. If you'd managed to dry enough meat, preserve enough berries in questionable sweetness, and stack your firewood high and proud, you'd be set for a semi-comfortable season. If not, well, you might have to start considering if your neighbor with the suspiciously plump chickens really needed all of them. But even among the hardship, humanity has always had a marvelous talent for making do and making light. Picture, if you will, a modest medieval household in late January. Outside, frost laces the trees like the whims of an artist with too much time and a single color. Inside, 5 people, 3 goats, and a chicken named Margot huddle around a flickering fire like it's the last warm thing on earth. The walls are lined with herbs long since dried. They smell of thyme, rosemary, and that one corner where someone swears they stored lavender, but now it just smells vaguely like potato. The room is dim, lit by the fire, a few candles made from dubious tallow, and the kind of blinding optimism it takes to make stew from the last turnip, half an onion, and a toe of garlic that looks like it's thinking about retiring. Clothing in winter wasn't just a wardrobe choice, it was architecture. Layers weren't merely stacked, they were engineered. Wool cloaks, linen shifts, breeches upon breeches. People looked less like individuals and more like walking laundry sacks with ambitions. And still, they were cold. Historical records are full of stoic understatement. The winter was somewhat disagreeable, often meant everyone's eyebrows froze off, and we had to take turns sleeping closest to the fire lest we become human icicles. But, oh, the resourcefulness. Early communities used animal fat lamps for light, clayed over, windows to keep out the wind, and any temptation to accidentally break through the glass, because, well, glass was for churches and royalty, and snow piled against the outer walls for extra insulation. A move both environmentally savvy and proof of great passive-aggressive energy toward the outdoors. And yet, despite these conditions, or perhaps because of them, winter became a time rich with stories. Oral traditions blossomed beside firelight. Grandparents, those resilient champions of survival and elaborate tangents, flourished in the long nights. They passed down tales, riddles, and entire family mythologies, sometimes invented in real time to explain why the cow only gave milk every third Tuesday. This storytelling had real community significance. In the absence of schoolhouses or printed books, entertainment and education often rolled into the same sleepy bundle. Children learned cautionary tales, herbal knowledge, and why you never ever step on the hearthstone with your left foot during a thunderstorm. It supposedly offended house spirits. The adults, meanwhile, found comfort, and perhaps a little ego boost, in recounting how much colder it was when they were young, when wolves were bolder, sleet was slipperier, and they had fewer teeth but more purpose. Even music survived, especially if you could play spoons, fiddle, or simply thump a rhythm on the table without accidentally knocking it over. Winter was a time for song-making, song-mangling, and cheeky lyrics passed from village to village, always evolving like a suspicious cheese left too near the stove. But perhaps most vital, through all this frostbitten camaraderie, was the food. Not just the practical bits, the dried beans, the buried cabbages, the terrifying yet strangely delicious sour porridge, but the ceremonial attempts to lift spirits. Wassailing, for example, offered the perfect excuse to bang pots outdoors while pretending it helped apples grow. It bonded neighbors scared off spirits, or at least squirrels, and gave people a reason to consume something stronger than tea. Winter wasn't just about survival. It was about adaptation, routine, and the quiet rituals that made life not just bearable, but meaningful. Every cracked bowl of stew, every makeshift blanket fort of doom, every song hummed into the dark represented a rebellion against the cold and a toast to shared humanity. And as the snow outside starts to melt just slightly, as daylight stretches its fingers a minute or two longer, villagers would begin turning inward, pondering spring, not with haste, but with a kind of polite curiosity. But first, before new seeds were planted and hopeful lambs stumbled into the world, there was still the matter of February. And February, as every seasoned villager knew, had its own spectacular way of testing your last nerve and your last candle. By the time late January arrived in the northern latitudes, the snow had decided to build a permanent residence. It wasn't content with a light dusting. No, it wanted a 3-foot thick woolen blanket across every thatched roof, slumbering field, and suspiciously silent goat. And the people within those early communities, still months away from their first dandelion leaf, leaned even more heavily on their most treasured winter survival tool: patience dressed in 3 layers of wool. With stone hearths crackling in the center of single-room homes, families huddled together like human burritos, wrapped in cloaks that often carried the rustic aroma of both sheep and soup. Firewood, carefully rationed since the first frost, was now more valuable than the fancy ceramic bowl great-uncle Larth brought back from the village fair in 482. And so began the season of sitting very close to the fire and extremely far from personal space. In truth, keeping warm was not achieved through roaring Viking bonfires, nor magical Roman underfloor heating in these places, but via something far more ancient and effective: shared body heat and a willingness to ignore Cousin Egil's snoring. In harsh winters, entire villages would adopt what you might romantically call communal hibernation. People stuffed hay into bed frames for insulation, peered wistfully at dwindling candles, and told stories in the dark, mostly involving mischievous animals, odd dreams, or hypothetical meals. Diet during this time was inventive, if we're being charitable. Root vegetables, salted fish, pickled, things, some of which modern humans would be hesitant to identify without hazmat gloves, all made an appearance. Fermentation, the ancient equivalent of a miracle, kept many bellies full and guts confused. Sauerkraut, for instance, was not just a future hot dog topping. It was a crucial winter food, preserving cabbage and a hint of sharp character through months of snowdrift gloom. And yes, grains. Blessed be the barley, the oat and the rye. Threshed in high summer, hoarded, through fall, and ground into flour with the kind of elbow grease that built arm muscles visible through 3 tunics. Porridges of varying viscosities with a breakfast, lunch, and oftentimes the philosophical topic of the day, especially when someone tried to add dried berries and sparked a mild revolution. Social life in this frozen chapter of the calendar tilted heavily toward the horizontal. Toddlers learned to walk entirely indoors, occasionally ending their journey headfirst into a spinning spindle. Elders dispensed wisdom from benches near the fire, often beginning with such sentences as "in the winter of the bad onions," or "when the wolves came down from the hills," and by wolves I mean Ingrid's second husband. Yet through it all, there emerged a strange coziness, a rhythm set not by the sun, which was on strike until March, but by the heartbeat of the household. Time was measured not in hours, but in how many logs were left, how many stories had been repeated. 7 seemed to be the number where people politely phased out, and how many pickled beets remained before it was socially acceptable to cry. But perhaps nothing kept spirits aloft, albeit wobbly, as much as song. Music, passed ear to ear across generations, became the glue of unity. Without instruments, melodies were hummed. Without daylight, rhythms were tapped gently on the wooden floor. Lullabies, work songs, and celebratory refrains for the successful lighting of the fire on the first try. We humans, it seems, have always been desperate for a reason to sing. And then, when the occasional thump on the roof signaled snow sliding mischievously from the shingles, or when the fire sputtered in 4th century Morse code, people remembered winter's worst might test them, but it also brought them nearer, pressed close and softer spoken. Outside, the snow kept its vigil. Inside, life decelerated, and in the pause, small joys glowed like sparks from a hearth. Waiting, listening, enduring. As the snow deepened and the jars on the pantry shelf grew ragged with uncertainty, one thing became clear. Spring might be far away, but invention, stubbornness, and soup were still very much at hand. And, as the calendar silently edged ahead, preparations stirred. Whispers of seeds, of thaw, and of ancient rituals meant to woo the sun from its slumber. As the first true frost painted the world in delicate lace, early communities turned to their ancient lifelines, storage pits, borrowed myths, and a rather suspicious degree of optimism for people who hadn't seen a carrot in 3 weeks. By early December, any crop not in the ground was either in a root cellar or in your dreams. And believe me, these dreams grew vivid when you'd gone days chewing on parsnip-themed variations for all 3 meals. Carrot mush, parsnip broth, boiled squash, with just a hint of squinting optimism. The menu wasn't diverse, but it was orange. Storage pits were the grandmother of refrigerators, the kind only slightly cooler than your breath, but crucially, immune to bears if you'd done it properly. Dug deep into the earth, lined with straw or sand, these clever cavities held onto the year's harvest like an anxious squirrel who majored in civil engineering. Onions, beets, potatoes, yes, even the turnips, though never eagerly, were lowered in and kept cool by the Earth's naturally smug insulation system. Now, in most early agricultural societies, winter survival wasn't just logistics, it was performance art. You had to choreograph your firewood use like an opera, ration your food like a medieval spreadsheet, and convince yourself daily that lentils were in fact satisfying. It helped that hunger made many things taste rich, including the concept of boiled bark. That was particularly true during the coldest weeks, when pockets of frost would sneak into your home like shy house guests and settle right next to you on the sleeping mat. Early homes weren't exactly airtight fortresses. They smoked more than a French cafe in 1953 and whistled in the wind like a flirtatious ghost. But what they lacked in insulation, they made up for in proximity. You're much less prone to frostbite when 7 people, 10 chickens, and 1 disgraced goat are all sleeping on top of each other. Clothing, meanwhile, became more conceptual than fashionable. Pelts were the haute couture of survival. Deerskin wrapped around limbs, sheepskin hats hugged heads, and somewhere in the mix, mittens were born, not because of their elegance, but because losing fingers to frost just wasn't trendy. Sewing leather with bone needles took patience, skill, and a fair degree of finger pricking. But fashion in 3500 BCE didn't require symmetry, just tenacity and an understanding that animal smells were now your winter perfume. Entertainment, scarce as sunlight, leaned heavily on storytelling. The elder with the creakiest knees usually claimed storytelling rights, their wisdom confirmed by surviving at least 4 suspicious winters and mastering the exaggerated pause. Around the hearth, tales flowed like warm cider. Not that anyone had cider, but the stories were sweet enough on their own. There were cautionary fables of villagers who mocked the wind and later married moss, and uplifting parables where clever foxes outwitted winter itself by hiding inside soup pots. The rhythm of days lost clarity. With 9 hours of daylight and 15 of not, people's inner clocks went a bit haywire. Some communities embraced it like an artistic choice. Sleep came in batches. First sleep, a twilight waking period filled with reflection or mild confusion. Then second sleep. This practice, well documented, made winter feel like one long dream layered in 2 acts, with a snack break in between. And though hunger might tail them like a nervous apprentice, communities found joy in the little extras. Herbs dried behind chimneys, the surprise of a garlic bulb that hadn't gone rebellious, or the last apple, wizened but noble, guarding its flavor with pride. These were treasured like relics, the sacred last onion or the privately stashed spice, quantities so meager they required ceremonial use, like blessing a soup with 1 bay leaf and stirring as though invoking ancestral approval. Winter offered no illusions. It was hard, It was damp in the places you didn't know could be damp. Yet somehow, people endured. They adapted. They improvised. They huddled and hustled, whispered and waited. And when the temperature dropped low enough to freeze your eyebrows slightly mid-blink, they simply pulled their cloaks tighter and added another layer of quiet resolve. The fire, sputtering, was never just heat. It was defiance, a flickering middle finger to a season that tried its best to be inhospitable. Each ember whispered, "Still here." And so they were, somewhere nestled under thatched roofs and thick with the scent of smoked roots and damp wool. Eyes began to close. Stories began to fade into shared breath, and dreams, curled in animal skins and ancient tales, rolled softly into the endless white outside. But in the distance, closer than it seemed, there stirred the faint drums of ancient celebration, and the dawn of something altogether warmer, while the frost held dominion over every field and stone, and puddles crackled like brittle glass under wool-wrapped feet. There was one modest miracle that gave early communities a rare sense of triumph over the season's indifference. The hearth, that is the fireplace, not to be confused with the modern romance novel concept of hearth and home, which implies a cozy ambience and possibly a pie cooling on a windowsill. No, this was a more rugged beast, both savior and smoke machine. In the heart of a single-room dwelling, usually shared by several generations of chattering humans and the occasional goat, the hearth served as the beating heart of winter life, albeit a heart that belched soot and demanded firewood like a diva demands red M and Mims. The oldest members of the group, whose joints creaked in weather slightly cooler than tepid, became keepers of the flame. Not metaphorically. They literally had to keep the flame alive, lest the entire household wake up colder than a fishmonger's handshake. Fire-starting tools were not convenient. No lighters, no matches. Just a bit of flint, some steel, and the hope that striking them together 473 times might produce a decent spark. Once lit, the fire roared, by which we mean it gave off just enough warmth to prevent one side of the body from freezing solid. Sitting too far and you'd shiver like a leaf. Too close and your wool tunic might begin to smoulder, prompting a surprised yelp and possibly the ancient equivalent of a wardrobe change. Still, the hearth had its charms. It cooked their food, dried their socks, and provided enough smoke to preserve meat, or at least thoroughly confuse it. It was the ultimate multitasker, part furnace, part kitchen stove, part fumigation service. If it had been sentient, it might have asked for a raise, and around it, life happened. Children huddled and carved little wooden animals using bone knives carefully handed down through generations, usually without serious incident. Fathers mended snares and traps, chewing through tangles of sinew and muttering less than holy oaths, while mothers stirred pots of something hot, steamy, and suspiciously turnip-based, praying someone hadn't mistaken soap root for parsnip again. At night, the glow of the fire was theatre. Shadows danced on the walls as stories stretched across them, animated by hands and voices. Tall tales of wolves who spoke Latin, rain that turned to coins, and heroes who slayed their enemies with nothing but a ladle and an impressive beard. In truth, there was no difference between legend and history when you were 12 days into January and hadn't felt your toes since solstice. Even the animals, thick with winter fur and judgmental stares, would draw near the gentle heat. Chickens puffed themselves into feathery spheres. Dogs uncurled beside children like biothermal blankets. Occasionally, a goat would attempt to eat a bit of someone's blanket, which, while not recommended, did lighten the mood. It wasn't all poetry and embers, of course. Even with the fire going, condensation collected on the inside of walls and ran down in cold rivulets. Odd drips from the ceiling prompted debates. Was it a leak? Melting frost? Some nihilistic spirit tear from the winter realm itself? Answers varied, and none were comforting. And it smelled. Were you expecting rose petals and pine? It smelled like smoke, wet wool, cooked roots, wet feet, and whatever experiment had just emerged from the cooking pot. But somehow, those smells, mingled with exhaustion and survival, became home. You see, the hearth wasn't just a fire, it was a defiance, a small, crackling rebellion against the ice-hardened world outside. And yet, fuel was finite, wood was precious, and gathering it in winter meant pushing through knee-deep snow for a few damp branches singing a sad, soggy song. That is to say, they hissed and smoked when tossed on the fire, but nobody complained. Heat was heat after all, even if it came with temporary eye-watering. But as the nights wore on and fires dimmed into quietly glowing coals, families would drift to sleep, heads bundled in furs and dreams full of sun-dappled fields and fruit-heavy trees. Meanwhile, beyond the firelight's reach, the wind howled its cold opinion, and the snow grew deeper. And while the fire fought bravely from within, others turned thoughtful eyes toward another ancient challenge of winter life: food, its scarcity, its temperaments, and the unique art of keeping both yourself and your dried beans alive just a little while longer. The cold had a curious way of making things louder and quieter at once. Snow blanketed the landscape in a hush, muffling footsteps and the creak of old wooden dwellings. Yet inside those dwellings, inside the ramshackle huts, sod houses and smoke-stained longhouses, you could hear everything. The snap of twigs in the hearth, the whistle of wind through a half-chinked wall, the ancient crinkle of a grandmother's wool-wrapped knees as she shifted on a log stool for the 75th time that morning. This was the season of indoor innovation, when early communities discovered remarkable ways to stay warm, sane, and, perhaps most impressively, not irritated into permanent exile by their own family members. In the darkening days of late winter, when the snow had lost its charm and the shadows hung a little heavier, there came a time our ancestors both dreaded and prepared for: the season of cabbage regret. You see, food preservation had come a long way since the days of placing your leftovers in the nearest conveniently cold hole. By the Iron Age, and in some cases long before, folks had figured out basic fermenting, salting, drying, and the magical art of keeping things only slightly mouldy. Root cellars were dug into frosty ground and filled with everything from parsnips to dried fish, stored like winter's version of party favors. Cabbage often featured prominently in these stores because it could endure the passage of time without protesting much. But after several months of boiled cabbage, stewed cabbage, cabbage mush, and cabbage that had definitively seen things, even the most stoic elder would begin casting long, soulful looks at the neighbor's sheep. Not to eat, necessarily, just for variety. One inventive solution to the culinary Groundhog Day was communal cooking, a surprisingly early tradition. It turns out that when multiple families shared a central fire, or, as some clever folks in Neolithic Europe did, a large stone oven in the center of a settlement, they could pool their ingredients, reduce fuel use, and, best of all, combine cabbage with things that weren't more cabbage. These shared feasts not only provided emotional ballast against the monotony of preserved food, they also helped with portioning, gossip proliferation, and, naturally, the art of politely declining someone's 14th retelling of the New Year's bear chase of 93. Note, 93 BCE. The bear was fine. Then there was the music. Or what passed for music. In many early winter settlements, be it a Bronze Age roundhouse deep in Britain's soggy interior, or a Viking longhouse groaning under snow in what is now Norway, nights were often filled with the musical stylings of whatever could be tapped, plucked, thumped, or chanted. Bone flutes, which sound romantic until you remember what bone implies, were surprisingly popular. Animal hide drums provided rhythm, and strings made from sinew or horsehair were strung across wooden frames for pitchy accompaniment. Not so much a concert, more a cooperative rhythmic situation. But it passed the time. Stories, of course, were the oxygen of long winters. Oral traditions cascaded down through generations huddled by the firelight, reshaped with each retelling. Tales of misbehaving spirits, trickster animals, romantic tragedies, and the occasional pugilistic goose. Children learned which ancestor outran a landslide, which one married suspiciously well during a famine, and which one invented the community's first attempt at skis, only to slide directly into a frozen bog, thus inventing bruises. Adults, meanwhile, used stories as subtle reminders of communal lessons. Don't mix willow bark with fermented mare's milk. Don't insult the hearth spirit, even jokingly. Don't volunteer to just check if the ice is ready. And of course, customs emerged to honor the passing of this long season. Early agricultural societies in Mesopotamia and later in Mesoamerica built ceremonies around the winter solstice, not just to note the turning of the sun, but to convince themselves that yes, eventually, green things would return. They sang, burned symbolic wood, anointed figurines, or in some cases, danced wearing masks on backwards to confuse evil spirits into wandering the wrong way. Historians debate their effectiveness, but one can't deny the boldness of a tactical backward dance. And as the days inched toward warmth, so too did an odd little sense of hope begin to bloom in those cramped, smoky rooms. Someone would notice that their stored seeds hadn't rotted. Someone else would spot a bird, the actual flapping kind, not just one the dog found frozen. Preparations would begin again, slow and tentative. But before the thaw, before the runoff turned paths into squelching soup, communities had one last duty to fulfill, ensuring the tools, both literal and metaphorical, were ready. And so, as snow still curled against door frames, they turned their attention to sharpening blades, reshaping rudimentary plows, and sewing together the bags that would carry spring's first seeds. But the most delicate work, really, the quietest, most careful part, was preparing the imagination for life beyond the frost. And that, more than any soup recipe or choreographed backwards goose opera, was what carried them into the next season. Now, let's drift a little further into that world, where the first signs of the great melt whisper their way into frozen forests and sleepy fields. As the cold set in like an overzealous house guest, arriving 3 hours early and staying 3 months too long, early communities found themselves increasingly reliant on a strange and wonderful invention: the winter feast. Now, to clarify, this was not the jolly, over-decorated, capitalism-enhanced feast we might think of today. No pine-scented candles or whipped cream-topped cocoa mugs. No Instagram posts of gravy boats with hashtags like #blessed and stuffed. Ancient feasts were humbler, smokier, and often surprisingly chewy, but they were absolutely crucial. You see, winter wasn't just about physical survival, it was about morale. A long winter without a morale booster was like trying to row a canoe with a single wooden spoon. So people gathered. They gathered around fires, around steaming pots of gruel, around the one person in the village who could play a hollowed-out deer bone like a flute. The timing of these feasts was often astutely aligned with celestial events. The midwinter solstice, that darkest of days with the longest night, became a marker. Well, someone likely said, in a vaguely prehistoric accent, that's as bad as it's going to get. Might as well eat the dried mushrooms and tell stories about how the sun probably isn't gone forever. And so, feasting emerged. That midwinter moment became a pause, a breather in the long tempo of snow and scarcity. The community came together to share what they'd preserved: smoked meats, dried, fish, fermented vegetables, roots stored like treasure in deep pits. It wasn't abundance, but it was enough. People didn't just eat, they performed. The storyteller would paint the air with tales, some true, some wildly speculative, about why the river froze only on Tuesdays, or how the moose once spoke fluent human, but got bored and walked off. Dances would kick up dust, well, snow probably, and drumming on the hollow logs would keep feet moving, resisting the lure of frostbite and melancholy alike. Even games emerged during these communal cabin fever sessions. In some regions, children played riddling games using bones, which sounds macabre, but, as you'll recall, entertainment options were limited. In other places, sticks and bundled cloth turned into makeshift balls for indoor tossing games, an activity possibly invented 2 minutes before someone's dried bean storage met a tragic fate. Sometimes these feasts doubled as strategic planning meetings, albeit ones lubricated with considerable amounts of whatever fermented beverage the community specialized in. Mead, beer, berry wine. All were consumed in quantities that aided communal bonding, even if they did not always support seamless decision-making. You can imagine a village leader declaring between hiccups, "We'll build the next shelter entirely out of frozen fish." Just imagine the insulation. Spirits lifted, even if only temporarily. That lifting of the collective mood, the pulling of each other up from the metaphorical snowbanks of winter blues, that was worth more than the meal itself. Because survival wasn't just calories, it was connection. These gatherings also served another crucial purpose, reminding people that even though the earth had gone eerily quiet and most things worth nibbling were buried under 3 feet of snow, they were not forgotten. They were still part of something, still woven into the slow beating heart of the community. Of course, there were those winters when the feast was optimistic, when there weren't enough caches, when game was scarce, when the ice did not part for the fishing spears, and the roots stored beneath the hut turned to mush. In those years, the feast was called anyway, and people met with empty bowls and agreed to pretend. They sang the old songs a little softer. The stories got longer, perhaps because filling time helped to forget the pang in the belly. But even then, these gatherings served a purpose. They were a quiet resistance to what winter demanded. They said, "No matter how cold or lean, we are still here. We are still ourselves." And that, more than preserved onions or dried elk strips, is what got them through. Next, we'll gently lower ourselves into another layer of winter wisdom, when survival meant not just warmth and food, but understanding the rhythm of the land beneath the snow, in the depths of winter's grasp, with the world outside grumbling beneath a quilt of snow and ice. Early, communities turned their hearts, and more importantly, their hands, to the ancient and noble art of doing things indoors. You must understand, dear listener, that without television, smartphones, or even mildly heated floor tiles, Our ancestors had to dig deep into their inventiveness to avoid both frostbite and a terminal case of boredom. Inside the low, smoky warmth of a communal longhouse or a snug stone cottage, winter transformed into something almost festive. If you squinted past the chilblains, the hearth became more than a fire. It was the television, kitchen stove, central heating system, and therapist's office rolled into one. Meals simmered slowly over the flames, mostly because nothing else would cook in an ice-cold kitchen. People feasted on preserved meats, root vegetables that looked like they regretted being born, and countless bowls of thick stew, each one more suspiciously mysterious than the last. Was that a parsnip or someone's shoe? Difficult to say, but both were edible if you were hungry enough. But the kitchen, if one could dignify a smoky fire pit with that word, wasn't just a place for food. It was a stage. Here, elders leaned in close, spinning tales passed down for generations, some heroic, others utterly bonkers. One might hear the epic of the great snow chicken, a frost-fighting fowl of legend, or tales of the barefoot ancestor who walked 20 miles uphill both ways to fetch firewood and came back with a wife, a goat, and hypothermia. In these long, dark days, storytelling was not only entertainment, it was education, therapy, and occasionally propaganda. And let's not underestimate the drama of old-fashioned gossip. Whoever said early humans lacked nuance never eavesdropped on a 9th century conversation about whose goat wintered better. Did you hear about Wilfred's ewe? Got her mittens, actual mittens. While the elders spoke, hands stayed busy. Wool was carded, thread was spun, and garments were patched up with varying degrees of success. One poor lad emerged from winter wearing what could be generously described as a woolen mistake with sleeves. Nevertheless, practicality trumped fashion, unless you count antler-trimmed hats, which were the height of snowy season couture. Nothing says, "I know what I'm doing," like decorative deer parts perched atop your head. Children, poisoned by neither sugar nor screen time, invented games using whatever lay around: bones, stones, leftover yarn, and boundless imagination. They reenacted hunts, traded pebbles as currency, and invented rules so convoluted not even they understood the point. If I touch the wall, and she touches the dog, and you sing the spinning song, I win, one would declare triumphantly. And so they slept well, for confusion is tiring. The off-season from farming and foraging was also a moment of quiet industry. Tools were repaired using what little was available: sinew, spit, and stubborn determination. Snowshoes were relashed. Sleds were inspected for structural betrayal. And if someone was ambitious, or just frustratingly optimistic, they'd whittle a new spoon. Entire days could pass debating whether a certain spoon was, in fact, a ladle, and thus, whether it warranted ceremonial naming rights. And let's not forget those brave souls who took up rustic music, with flutes made of bone and drums made from, let's just say, local materials. These intrepid musicians filled the air with melodies that have since been lost to time and probably regret. The acoustics of a thatched house were, shall we say, forgiving, which is essential when your cousin insists on perfecting the same 3 notes all winter. Even romance took on a particular glow in winter, when proximity bred fondness, or at least convenience. There's a certain magic in huddling for warmth, and many a family line can thank a particularly frosty January for its continued existence. Courtship dances might be hosted indoors, involving stomping, spinning, and the occasional elbow to the soup pot. Through all this, they endured, because humans are nothing if not persistently adaptable. They quilted their way through bleak mornings, laughed through freezing evenings, and found moments of joy in the soft flicker of firelight on a wool, itchy face. And as the snow deepened and the soup thickened, they did what all winter-bound humans have ever done. They waited for thaw and sun and the glorious release of spring, when mud and bugs return like old friends no one invited. But before those first green shoots dared greet the frozen soil, something else stirred, something quieter, almost sacred. A shift, not in nature, but in spirit. A moment of collective breath held in solemn recognition of the season's end tiptoeing ever closer. The next night, by firelight and whispered memory, their attention would turn to the sky and to the unlikely art of mapping it with nothing more than wonder in their hearts and frozen toes tucked under layered wool. As the snow deepened and the sun turned into the kind of faint, apologetic glow that barely bothered to rise, our early ancestors reached for their most time-tested resource: each other. Yes, forget fire. Forget mammoth pelts. Forget stone tools carved to surgical perfection with a rock the size of an onion. The real survival strategy: community gossip and a good group huddle. Picture it: a tiny mud and thatch dwelling no bigger than your modern-day living room, and certainly less ventilated. 8 to 10 people, plus 2 goats and a chicken with commitment issues, all tucked in together for the winter. It may not sound glamorous, because it absolutely wasn't. But in a world before insulation, thermostats, and anything resembling central heating, proximity was the secret ingredient. Not too romantic when everyone smells like root vegetables and damp fur, but highly effective. These little clusters of humanity would pass the time through stories, songs, and what we'd now label rituals, though they probably called it something more blunt, like, let's stop talking about how cold it is for 5 minutes. Historians believe that winter gatherings were crucial for passing down cultural knowledge, and not just about how to keep dry while sleeping next to a snoring uncle who won't stop hogging the mammoth skin. Oral tradition flourished during these frozen months, when people had fewer chores, but far more idle hours. Time slowed down, stretched like the last bit of fat on a dried-out haunch of elk, and in that slowness came comfort. Tales of ancestors, legends of spirits, and likely more than a few stories about someone who once accidentally ate the snow used for the bathroom corner. You might be wondering how they managed without daylight, which in deep winters only visited for a handful of hours. The answer? They redefined what evening meant. When candlelight, or rather fish oil, lamp flickers, was your only source of light after dusk, people adapted to a rhythm of rest and wakefulness that came in gentle waves. They dozed off in shifts, waking for midwinter banter or to check if the roof still existed above them. Sleep wasn't a rigid 8-hour sprint. It was a rolling promenade through drowsiness, dreams, and the occasional elbow to the ribs when someone tried to steal the warmest part of the straw mat. Outside, the world was a breathtaking freezer. Trees groaned under the weight of snow. Rivers slowed to a crusty crawl, and wildlife either scurried underground or boldly ransacked the food storage if the thatch looked particularly nibbleable. Inside, preservation was the name of the game, not just for food, but for sanity. Some communities would create winter games or performance rituals that involved both movement and humor. Again, things we'd call traditions, and they just called, "What else are we going to do?" These activities weren't just quaint, they were crucial. Laughing burned calories, dancing gave you a reason to stand up, and mimicking animal sounds in an exaggerated fashion, while possibly embarrassing in warmer months, was completely fair game in the dead of winter. It was a time when survival wasn't heroic, but habitual. No grand dramas, just small victories. Managing to dry out damp socks by the fire, unearthing a forgotten root vegetable from the storage pit, or finally convincing cousin Torvald to go outside and relieve himself instead of repurposing the clay pot again. There was a rhythm, a lullaby of frost and whispers, and if you ignored the occasional crumbling ceiling beam or mysterious smoke leak, it could be strangely comforting. People adjusted not just habits, but expectations. A good winter wasn't one without hardship. It was one where you knew which walls were the least drafty, and someone remembered all the verses to the night song about the owl that married a hole in the ground. The cold demanded togetherness, and in that closeness bloomed something delicate and lovely, like a seed dreaming beneath the snow. Despite everything, they endured, not by brute force, but through rituals of warmth, both literal and emotional. Boredom was turned into bonding. Scarcity became creativity, and time, slow and heavy as snow on thatch, shaped not just how they lived, but how they remembered. Outside, frost was forming new crystal kingdoms, but indoors, among bundles of fur and flickers of lamplight, something old and gently wise was happening. As the embers glowed and evening folded itself once more into darkness, another winter memory nestled itself into the fabric of survival, one heartbeat at a time. And just like that, as the wind whispered promises through cracks in ancient walls, something even older stirred, an idea that maybe the cold wasn't the enemy after all, but a quiet teacher. A soft hush fell across the night, and far away, in a place where history still held its breath, the first signs of midwinter dreaming began to stir. Beneath a sky dusted with stars more vivid than most modern humans ever see, early winter dwellers climbed into shelters that groaned with the weight of accumulated frost and dreams. Try to picture it. A collection of smoky circles dug into the snow, roofed with hides, built against the howling wind like a defiant whisper. No streetlights, no thermostats, not even a podcast. But our ancestors were nothing if not innovative in their chilly inertia. When tools were few and supplies even fewer, they leaned on one of humanity's most durable survival mechanisms: excessive storytelling. The nights were long, and so were the tales. Families and clans curled near weak fires, fire that never quite warmed the toes unless you sat directly on top of it, which they did not recommend. If the fire didn't get you, the smoke certainly tried. It curled lazily under the low ceiling, seasoning their clothing, hair, and probably the porridge. People would smell like winter for months. Despite the ambience of slow-cooked wood and unwashed fleece, these gatherings were the lifeblood of the season. Elders recounted mythology, hunting legends, and deeply dramatic accounts of last winter's turnip harvest, described with all the suspense of a modern thriller. Imagine a story climaxing not with a dragon, but with someone successfully digging up a frozen root vegetable. The crowd would gasp. Someone might faint with excitement. It was high drama by candlelight, minus the candles. Singing also filled these hollow, frozen spaces. Songs served many purposes: to pass time, lift spirits, and on occasion, drown out the sounds of Cousin Ernest snoring into a bucket. Some used bone flutes carved from their dinner, or stretched taut animal hide across hollow wood to make drums, beginning a long history of accidentally inventing music genres. It may shock you to know that proto-jazz was not entirely unheard of around the Neolithic hearth, especially when Aunt Rona brought out the rattling stones and accidentally syncopated. And of course, there was the ritual of food rationing. that sacred act of holding up a very small piece of dried fish and pretending it was still exciting. Salted meats, roots stored in dirt floor cellars, and mysterious preserved things whose colour said probably nutritious, if not completely familiar. People got creative. If you've never eaten bark stew thickened with crushed lentils, well, it's an acquired taste, and often a result of there being absolutely nothing else. To keep spirits high, early communities leaned on shared duties and seasonal rituals. Keeping snow off the roof was both a necessity and a kind of daily icy meditation. Fetching water from holes cut into frozen rivers became a social highlight, where gossip flowed even if the stream did not. Someone would always say something like, "It's colder than a sky spirit's, kiss out here." And everyone would laugh, though no one knew what that meant. Even clothing took on ceremonial airs during winter. People layered furs upon furs, until everyone resembled a well-dressed bear who had fallen into a haberdashery. The cold was a constant reminder that the outside world wanted you very much not to exist. But against all odds, humanity said, "Not today," and fashioned boots from reindeer legs. In some regions, snowshoes were essential and oddly elegant, strapped to the feet using sinew, bent wood, and sheer optimism. They allowed people to tread across the deep white without suddenly disappearing to their hips. Children learned to walk like moon explorers, wobbling gracefully and toppling only every fifth step. It was the earliest form of winter ballet, and far more entertaining than any festival. These communities also observed winter with quiet reverence. Moonlight, reflecting off snow, could silence even the most boisterous child. Some believed. The spirits walked more freely in these months, wearing cloaks of frost and whispering through pine branches. When someone heard the wind croon at night, they did not assume it was just weather. It might be the ancestors saying, "Wear an extra tunic, you'll catch cold." There, in the heart of winter, surrounded by wisps of breath and tales too old to trace, humanity endured. With worn mittens, cracked spoons, and laughter pressed between stories like herbs drying in the rafters, they endured. And as our fire of memory flickers warmly tonight, we'll drift next to another scene, where warmer days are imagined and survival moves from shelter to ceremony. As the snow piled thicker outside ancient huts and cottages, our determined little ancestors edged closer to an idea that would forever change their wintry odds. Preservation. Not preservation in the modern sense. No vacuum sealing, no expiration dates printed in Helvetica. This was the age of salt, smoke, ice, and sheer willpower. Let us ease into one of winter's quieter triumphs, the art of keeping things from rotting until you needed to chew on them. Because, as it turns out, you can't always hunt fresh elk in a blizzard, and drying apples takes more time than you'd think. In northern climes, deep cellars became the closest thing to refrigerators long before Frigidaire ever whirred its chilly hum. These earthy chambers, dug like cozy rabbit burrows beneath thatched homes, stayed cool in the summer and just cold enough in winter to resemble nature's own rooty crisper drawers. And oh, the root vegetables, dear turnips, parsnips and beets, silent heroes of the long, lean season. They slumbered in baskets wrapped in straw, vaguely aware that their destiny was due. No complaints, just quiet dignity in the dark. Meanwhile, meat preservation bordered on culinary alchemy. Across Europe, slabs of pork were salted until they became more mineral than mammal. Smoking meats wasn't just rustic, aesthetic, it actually worked. Bacon that was properly smoked could keep for months, which led to winter breakfasts that were surprisingly decadent, especially when eaten beside a hearth that popped and hissed like it had secrets. Ah, the hearth, that commanding soot-stained center of it all. It cooked, it warmed, it dried damp wool socks into crunchy cotton artifacts, and it guarded the bubbling pots of thickened broths, sturdy and steaming, as they simmered low and slow. These pots were the founding fathers of leftovers, not just meals, but meal lineage. We're talking stews that lasted for days, sometimes weeks, with new ingredients tossed in daily like logs on a fire. A medieval peasant could say of their soup, "My great-grandcarrot once swam in this very pot." But not all communities had the luxury of underground hidey holes or plump pig thighs. In some Arctic cultures, food preservation was the province of the ice itself. Seal meat was frozen solid in cubed blubber. Containers, nature's Tupperware, stacked and buried in snowbanks that acted like walk-in freezers. The concept of frostbite did not stop these people from carefully planning menus down to the protein popsicles. Even milk and dairy could be discouraged from misbehaving. Yogurt, kefir, curds. These were pre-modern methods of convincing milk to remain edible while it turned progressively weirder. Cheese, after all, is just milk's retirement plan. In the Swiss Alps, summer milk was aged into hard wheels and stacked like edible furniture, ready to return in fierce snowstorms as either dinner or doorstop. For the Norse, dried fish became a real specialty. Cod would be desiccated on long racks, transformed by wind into something that resembled a musical instrument more than a meal. The result was stockfish, a food so hard it had to be physically beaten before cooking. If you wanted to eat it, you first had to challenge it to a duel. But warmth was as much sought in festivity as in food. Winter preservation wasn't simply about staving off hunger. It was about preparing for communal hearthside joy. Preserved meats meant you could host a winter feast. Wheel cheeses doubled as bargaining chips or wedding gifts. Even dried fruits, wild berries flattened into leathery discs, became cherished as sweet treats, the fruit roll-ups of the Iron Age. Through it all, these early communities developed precise intuitive knowledge about how long something could last, which fungus was friendly, and how smoked meats should smell when they were trying to kill you. It wasn't chemistry. It was survival. It was tradition. It was sometimes a little crunchy. And while modern people have their chest freezers and Amazon Prime pantries, none of it quite stirs the soul like a root cellar lined with clumsy clay jars, their contents unknown, but spiced with the promise of dinner. So as wood smoke curled from chimney stones, and somewhere a rutabaga dreamed quietly beneath a wool blanket of moss, winter preservation stood, unseen, underfoot, and undeniably essential. Still, of all these cozy acts of preparation, none was perhaps as quietly profound as what came next, the lessons they passed on around the fire. Wisdom tucked between stories, folded into song, like recipes in lullabies. And under candle-warm eaves, with bellies full of yesterday's soup and tomorrow's patience, our ancestors began crafting something even more enduring, memory. But that, dear dreamer, is a tale to warm another twilight. In the pliant hush of deep winter, when firewood was more precious than gossip, and roofs groaned under the weight of snow like sleepy giants mumbling in their dreams, early communities turned inward, not just physically, but spiritually. With the fields frozen solid and the sun offering the barest whisper of warmth, people found themselves in tighter quarters, surrounded by kin adjacent, and the occasional freeloading goat that had somehow earned squatters' rights in the pantry. It was during these long, icicle-draped months that early societies relied most heavily on rituals, stories, and the ritualistic telling of stories, without streaming platforms, or even the simple opiate of indoor plumbing. They discovered the miracle drug of oral tradition. The fire crackled, yes, but so did Grandma Olga's tale of the time her great-uncle tried to woo a village girl with nothing but a cabbage and heroic confidence. She always swore it had worked. To this day, no one is sure if she meant the cabbage or the confidence. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were insulation, layered between generations like woolen blankets. They reminded people who they were, what beasts they'd bested, what winters they'd bested, and what haphazard recipes they'd survived. Because let's be honest, winter didn't just test your soul, it tested your palate. Without fresh crops, menus became something of a post-apocalyptic potluck. Root vegetables emerged from storage like wizened prophets, beets, turnips and onions shriveling heroically, but still very much available for dinner service. Occasionally, salted fish would make an appearance, its aroma entering the room several minutes before the dish itself. It was lovingly called winter perfume, and less lovingly called, oh no, not again. But even these humble meals could be magical. Food, after all, was more than sustenance. It was reason for gathering, for laughter, for splitting the last boiled potato 6 ways and pretending it was a feast. There's something heartening, possibly delirious, about scraping the bottom of a porridge pot and still managing to argue over whose had less. In the Nordic lands, long before IKEA provided Allen wrenches and meatballs, people warded off seasonal despair with celebrations like Yule. They lit up the stone dark days with bonfires, evergreen branches, and a lot of drinking. Copious, cheer-inducing, greet your neighbour like they're an elk drinking. It was both cultural expression and biological necessity, sort of like putting on socks. For your soul. And whether you were in a Norse longhouse smelling faintly of moss and mead, or a wood and wattle English hut nestled among sheep that refused personal boundaries, the heart of winter survival was not strength, but softness. They endured by leaning on each other, by singing, by sparring over board games that consisted of 7 pebbles and a very confusing rule system, and by reminding themselves every long twilight that the sun was creeping inevitably closer. Ah yes, let us not forget the dawn watchers. There was usually one, that over-eager type who, starting in mid-January, insisted at breakfast that the days were definitely longer now, arresting everyone with wide eyes and dramatic finger gestures toward the east, because nothing says grasping at hope, like squinting at a pale blur in the sky and declaring triumph. Meanwhile, scientific precision arrives slightly later. The earliest solar calendars, like those used by Neolithic communities, were essentially grand stone mood boards measuring shadow length. Think Stonehenge, but with less mystery and more, is it time to plant something yet? They weren't wrong to obsess. Timing the seasons was a matter of life, or, well, not eating. Night by night, people measured the length of candles, the stretch of one's shadow, the fading rations. And night by night, they burrowed a little deeper into warmth and memory. Survival didn't come from splitting firewood, though that helped. It came from layering, stories, songs, silence, and maybe, just maybe, the communal agreement that underwear was optional but huddling was not. As the snow-muted world lay quiet around them, these early folk found a rhythm, a heartbeat that didn't come from progress, but from presence. And somewhere, between the echo of an old song and the creak of a roof beam, Their eyes would grow heavy, and a new kind of warmth would descend, one you couldn't kindle with a flint. Soon, something else would stir in those long nights, a quiet art form, one that required no tools and very few potatoes. The winter sun, if you could even call it that, barely made an appearance over the tree line. It arrived late, yawned a bit, spilled some uninspired orange across the snow, and then promptly shuffled back to bed behind the hills, much like everyone else in the village was trying to do, except they were usually busier, trying not to freeze or starve. In those early communities, winter was not a season. It was a mood, a test, and an endurance marathon draped in pelts and gritted teeth. Yet surprisingly, or perhaps against all odds entirely, people managed. They did more than survive. They even dared to chuckle sometimes. You see, after months of root vegetables doing their best impersonation of dinner, idle hands turned to clever diversions. With outdoor chores prohibited by snowdrift and sheer hypothermia, communities pivoted to what they did best in close quarters: telling stories, making things, and occasionally passive-aggressively judging one another's knitting patterns. Inside those smoky, compact longhouses and huts built from thatch, moss, and stubbornness, something magical simmered alongside the soup. Not literally magical, that was mostly onions and hope, but there was a kind of cultural fermentation happening. As tightly wrapped family units huddled together, crackling firelight projected shadows that danced across mud walls, while oral tradition filtered through generations like well-worn mittens passed down, with slightly more holes and slightly less grace. This was when the village elders thrived, particularly those who were less mobile and more verbose, with endless evenings to fill and nowhere to walk but in circles. They'd sit near the hearth and dispense tales stitched partly with history, partly with exaggeration, and partly with whatever it took to ensure their grandchildren stayed quiet long enough for a nap. They told of the time the river froze so solid you could drag a cow across it, though of course what they didn't say was the cow refused, lay down, and was mistaken for a snowdrift until spring. They spoke of iron winters and hungry wolves and the birth of traditions that sounded uncannily like childcare solutions disguised as festivals. And oh, the festivals. Human creativity, it seems, burns hottest precisely when wood is in short supply. In that endless swirl of dark days and darker nights, entire customs emerge solely to make the coal feel slightly less rude. Midwinter feasts took place not just to honor deities, but to clean out anything perishable before it spoiled. Nothing says celebration like, "We have too much dried eel, let's throw a party." You'll find echoes of these instincts in modern holidays, just with fewer furs and marginally less herring. Were tools limited by today's standards? Absolutely. But ingenuity was in no short supply. Early people fashioned snowshoes from animal sinew and bent sticks, built ice fishing huts from logs insulated with cattail fluff stuffed into the cracks, and brewed hot beverages that admittedly tasted like boiled grass, but at least were warm and didn't kill you. Usually. In some regions, sledges were pulled by dogs, reindeer, or, if you were particularly ambitious and willing to deal with mood swings, your neighbour's goat. Transporting goods over snow became more efficient in winter than in the muddy messes of spring, though keeping said goods from freezing was another experiment altogether. Arl, incidentally, froze far faster than expected, leading to the discovery of what might have been history's first craft ice beer, and also the world's earliest hangover from licking a barrel. Yet, despite the shortages and frostbite risks, there were moments of soft beauty. Star patterns shone impossibly bright in the thin, dry air. Animal tracks told dramas in patterns across the snow. A lone bird call could sound like opera if you'd gone 3 days without any other sound. Quiet blanketed everything like snow itself, a hush so complete the creak of the roof timbers settling could feel poetic. And so, in between the chores wrapped in furs, the candle making, and the stealth eating of preserved berries supposed to last until March, these early communities fostered something rare: resilience with a side of humor. They mocked the weather as best they could, built traditions just to keep morale from collapsing, and invented survival tools disguised as toys or games or rituals. Because sometimes, when the wind claws at your door and the cold sits heavy in your bones, the best weapon isn't a sharper axe or a sturdier roof. Sometimes it's knowing the story of the goat who refused to pull the sled, but ran off with your mittens instead. And sometimes it's knowing that even this long winter has an end, which, incidentally, is just beyond the next snowfall. As the snow softened into spring's earliest whispers, the final embers of winter huddled like a shy guest reluctant to leave a party. The villagers, wrapped in wool, smoke, and a curious mishmash of lingering superstition and early science, began to exhale, slowly, like old floorboards easing under the weight of silence. In these early communities, surviving winter wasn't simply about bodily warmth. It was about imagination, and pickled turnips, but even more so, imagination. After spending months with nothing but dried beans, dried fish, and dried patience, people had to craft something else: hope in simmering form. By the end of every long winter, stories grew taller than the snowdrifts. Yarn spinners and elders once again became the most popular guests around the communal hearth. Their myths, born of equal parts boredom and fermented cider, kept spirits nourished when cupboards failed to. They spoke of fire spirits who could be summoned with the right combination of pine smoke and dramatic gesturing, of frost demons who only visited those who complained about cold knees, and of heroic chickens who had once laid eggs in the dead of January. Absolute lies, most likely, but terribly soothing ones. By late winter, the last of the animal fat had been scraped from the cooking pots, with a reverence bordering on religious. Every crumb of dried bread was a matter of parliamentary debate. Entire village councils were held over whether to soak it in weak broth or slightly weaker broth. Decisive politics, in these conditions, was a fantasy. Indecision was the only democracy that consistently survived freezing conditions. Yet, even as the night slowly shortened and the sky tried on lighter blues, the early communities didn't completely trust the weather. They had seen its trickery before. One sunny morning, a chirping bird, and then a blizzard with the temperament of an insulted deity. No one was brave enough to declare spring had truly arrived until the moss plumped up with confidence. Still, there were signs. The animals, who cared very little for human calendars, began to stir. The goats bleated in complaint, as if asking why life wasn't a perpetual hay buffet. Chickens gave suspicious side eyes to the melting snow, not quite trusting the thaw. And the dogs, they slept everywhere, especially in doorways, declaring themselves noble gatekeepers while strategically blocking people from leaving the warmer parts of the house. Herbalists crept out first, eager to spot the subtle reawakening of plants. These were the true optimists, people who had stared into the mush of dried nettles all winter and still believed the ground owed them something fragrant. They knew which fiddlehead ferns to pluck, which wild onions to sniff out, and how to coax tea from twigs that, to the untrained eye, looked like they belonged firmly in the firewood pile. Meanwhile, the blacksmith, who had spent the winter fiddling obsessively with increasingly abstract tools, like a double-ended spoon that had nearly caused a riot, emerged as well, blinked at the sun, and promptly sneezed the sneeze of someone who hadn't seen pollen since last September. Tools were mended, hinges oiled, and something curiously hopeful returned to the ringing sound of hammer on steel. And then, of course, came the mud. After the dignified stillness of snow and ice, the earth threw a bit of a tantrum. Paths became guesses. Boots were swallowed. Chickens disappeared for hours, only to emerge looking profoundly unsettled. And yet, there was something delightful in the slop, in this messy, squelching reminder that the world was dangerously and wonderfully alive again. The villagers began cleaning things in earnest, preparing for the return of motion. Sleds were put up, carts were caressed like long-lost ships, and clothes were cautiously shaken out, hoping mice hadn't recently declared them prime real estate. Everything smelled of old wool laced with cautious optimism. And when the first evening arrived where candles didn't need to be lit until after supper, people noticed, not with loud celebration, but with that quiet, collective exhale, the one that said, "We're still here." They had survived yet another season of cold, doubt, and creative legume-fueled cuisine. And though they had done it with crude tools, patchwork garments, and a staggering absence of citrus, what they had in abundance was each other. Shared jokes, whispered tales, the occasional goat-related misadventure. None of it grand, but everything essential. So now, breathe deep. Let the soft crackle of history's fire soothe your thoughts. The snow may still linger atop the thatch, quietly dreaming its own sleepy dream. But beneath it, beneath you, life stirs again. And as the wind outside grows softer and sleep gathers, like moss upon your thoughts, rest easy. For now the night is gentle and your bed is warm.